This Christmas reflection is titled Family from Coast to Coast. It was one of the kids that got it going. It would be noon Pacific time, and that way everyone could sit down to a meal somewhere between lunch and supper time, and they could all have the meal together. The kids on the West Coast would be fine with a midday feast, and the families through a mid-afternoon gathering thought it would be just fine, but would they be able to get Nan and Gramps at the table with everything working? This had really started back in the spring when everything else had happened. It was easy enough to FaceTime and Zoom and Messenger and all that among the younger folk, and they had Skyped with Mom and Dad before. But to time it right, well, that was going to be something. See, when Mom and Dad, or depending on which generation is talking, Grandma and Gramps, would travel, it was easy. They just landed somewhere, and they were always good motivators to get their family back into the church routine, so they made it a point to travel. And while they visited, everyone called or videoed in at that place. It was a thrill just 10 years ago when Graham and Gramps watched their great-grandson slinging sloppy mashed potatoes at his father at their table on the other side of the country through one of the kids' laptops. Graham's comment was classic. "Well, so much for hearing about this a week later in a letter. What an age." Wherever they landed, whoever was hosting would have to set things up so that Grandma and Grandpa could see the rest of the family. And last year, when Grandma and Gramps said they were getting too old to travel in the winter, everyone showed up at the old home place. They even had to open up a farmhouse and a couple of cottages that could be heated so that everyone could fit in the area. And the little kids camped out on the farmhouse floor by the old stone fireplace. They tried to stay up for Santa that year, but Gramps came to the rescue by telling them a long story about Christmas when he was a boy. And soon the tykes were all fast asleep on the couches and the rollouts and the camping mats. And all of them had a special thrill that everyone's stocking was filled with treats and toys, but also everyone had a big orange, just like Grandpa got when he was a boy. That was a very special year. Grandma had handwritten cookbooks for each member of the family, and Gramps had crafted special wooden toys for each of the little children, and a couple of the big ones. And they took the best Christmas picture you could imagine right before the largest snowball fight in family history. It was as they were sitting down after Christmas dinner and the discussion drifted that one of the kids mentioned about a strange thing happening in Asia, in China, someplace called Wuhan. It was in the news, and the West Coast crew mentioned that some people had taken some time off work after traveling because they're worried they might have caught some new bug. Well, we know where that goes, where it went. After the family all went back home after the best Christmas they could ever remember having, things went from bad to worse to scary. Soon calls to each other and home to Grandma and Gramps were no longer, "How are you doing?" They became more, "Are you okay? Are you being safe?" But spring came. And a lot of places the weather was pretty gracious. There was that at least. A church group helped deliver groceries to the grand folks for a bit until things and the rules sort of got sorted out. Grammy made masks. No, not just for her and Gramps, but for the whole household, and mailed them out. All over the country, Gramps complained, "Won't be any spare sheet sets your next visit. You're all wearing them now." The other big shock was the schools closing. "Never seen the like of it," Gramps said to the lady who dropped off the milk and eggs in exchange for a few loaves of Grammy's homemade bread. The biggest issue for Grammy and Gramps was missing church. Except for a couple of times each year, storm cancellations, they had never missed church in all their 52 years together. Now coming to the beginning of summer, and the only services were online, and they had only had an Easter service because one of their children called them and played them the service over the phone. They had the internet, but it was a slow connect where they were. They had email and sometimes looked at the kids' pictures on the Facebook. They were becoming more and more isolated, and that disconnect was making them anxious and their families getting worried. So one day late in June, the kids all made arrangements and someone came and hooked up a different system, a technician from some company. And shortly a tablet was delivered and that had everything all pre-installed, and soon after that it became the practice that Grandma and Gramps sat down for lunch. They would be joined by other parts of the family from a little further out west. The grandkids would be in a rush to tell their grandparents about their summer activities or the little bit of schooling they were getting or whether they went hiking. And best of all, Grandma and Grandpa got to watch online services each week, every week, though they watched them a little later in the day than they usually went to church. But that was in order to do this with some of the more Western families. The West Coasters even got up really early sometimes and joined them for church. Grandma mentioned at one point, we have been having more meals together and more time in church than we have in years. But everything really got real when one of the grandkids in Ontario was sent home from school after it started again in the fall because someone else in the school who he shared a class with had showed symptoms. And soon there were positive cases in the school and in the community and on the same street, and everyone was worried. The online visits with Grandma and Grandpa for the whole family always had prayers through that. Grandma and Grandpa were praying a lot more and a lot more together. At the end of 2 weeks, though, and a COVID test, the whole family was given the clear sailing. And everyone's thankful for the masks that Grandma had made. Birthdays and Grandma and Grandpa's anniversary, which someone always had made it home for, were a little more lonely. Though for the anniversary, Grandpa was proud to say, I took her on a picnic for our anniversary dinner. We ate your burnt hamburgers in the backyard picnic table and the bugs were a horror. Grandpa looked scandalized, but Grandma giggled. In the full scope of autumn, a plan got hatched to try and have Thanksgiving dinner together. And juggling the time zones and the meal, in the end, Grandma and Grandpa sat down to their meal with a few of the others, but even that was short-lived. The lighting was bad. They were all very frustrated. They were all very tired. Everyone was tired. But with Christmas coming, some trial runs were made, and a special login time was set up through a meeting platform that each family member could use. And then on one day, Christmas Day, well, let's just say it all came together. They had their Christmas miracle. And they all logged in their different times to watch the online service from back home in the old country church, recorded from the pew where Grandma and Grandpa always sat. And they listened closely as Grandpa gave the grace. Grandma nudged him when it got really long. And while they're planning to make it home over the next year, and to try and be home for Christmas too the next year, in a different but a very real sort of way, from coast to coast, this year, they felt more as a family, really celebrating and caring about what mattered, their love and their life as a family, the joy of their faith as they shared it together. And that made the celebration of Christmas, coast to coast, all the better.